Several outsiders, including Milton, Alberto's buddy and weekend neighbor, had worked out long-term agreements to rent quarters for weekend and summer use. As in 1973, many Arambeperos had sold or were renting their beachfront houses to people from Salvador. Some still followed the pattern of building duplexes, but by 1980 most villagers had decided to stay in the front, generally more comfortable, and to rent their rear portion, reversing the 1973 pattern as demands to rent increased. Tomei, the spectacularly successful fishing entrepreneur of the 1960s and early 70s, had left his wife for Sonia, a hippie woman. They shared a rental house with another family and only a curtain separating the two households. Tomei cited a housing shortage. He and his partner had been looking for several months for a dwelling, which they were willing to pay up to $125 per month, but outsiders had cornered the market. Arambepe's permanent immigration population had swollen from 24% in 1964 to 41% in 1980. Some were people renting beach quarters while working elsewhere. For example, the back of a house in the northern rectangle was rented to a young man who worked in Kamakari's booming petrochemical industry. The municipal seat was now just a 40-minute commute, compared with 2 to 3 hours in 1973. Other renters included bus drivers, Tibris workers, artisans, and others attracted by jobs in the expanding local economy. Several villagers had grown suspicious of a rental pattern in which villagers and outsiders agreed to long-term rental contracts. One homeowner complained to me that rich outsiders were renting villagers' homes and then treating them like their own. Some city folk had even hired lawyers claiming that they had contracted to buy in installments rather than simply rent the house. Although no one had yet lost title to a house through such a rental agreement, this was feared given the renter's clout and the external legal system. The Hippie Handbook. The hippie period in Arambepe's history had ended by 1980. Villagers remembered that the first hippies had appeared in the summer of 1966 and 67, but the main hippie years were 68 through 71, particularly 1970 and 71. I met fewer recognizable hippies in 1980 than in 1973. Just 9 had stayed on. In the opinion of many villagers, these people were no longer hippies. They had become permanent residents. By 1980, I had overcome my previous resentment toward the hippies. Rather than ignoring their presence, I spent some time investigating their current lifestyle and activities and trying to understand their place in local history. The hippies' arrival still loomed large in the villagers' perception of change. For Arambeperos, the hippie invasion divided local history into eras before and after. By 1980, many villagers were expressing saudades, or homesickness, nostalgia for the old days. The pre-hippie, untransformed Arambepe. They had lost their fascination with the new, and they remembered us, members of the anthropological field teams, as part of an increasing romanticized past. How specifically did Arambeperos now view hippies in their historical role? First of all, how does one identify a hippie? I found that villagers attributed certain stereotypical traits to hippies, and that even former hippies did exhibit characteristic ways of acting and thinking that set them off from other villagers. In other words, a hippie subculture was still discernible within Arambepe. One Sunday afternoon, I sat talking with a 60-year-old woman on the stoop of a brick home in the street down there. Through the open window of a house across the street, I saw a blonde woman who looked like an Ipa from Rio I had met in Aldea, the hippie settlement to the north, described further in the next section. A few days previously, my informant denied that this woman was a hippie, but she had no hesitation using the label for a couple who approached us looking for Sonia, Tomei's stigmatized hippie lover and my informant's neighbor. A few minutes later, the man who spoke with an Argentine accent was wearing expensive clothes and didn't look like a hippie to me. My companion focused on his beard and his request for information about Sonia and identifying him. Guilt by association. Furthermore, as an expression of her own hostility toward the hippies, particularly toward Sonia for taking another man's husband, my informant knowingly lied in answering the man's question. For villagers, important traits of hippies were hair and dress. Hippies had long hair. Men with beards were hippies. Hippies went around half naked. Men wore just loincloths. Women used brief halters and wore no bras. Males and females bathed together nude in the Caratinga River. Boys from Arambepe liked to bathe there too, to catch a glimpse of naked Ipas. Speech and diet gave additional clues. Foreign hippies had accents. More specifically, hippies spoke more slowly and softly than normal people did, reminiscent of laid-back American surfer dudes. Hippies also differed in diet and consumption patterns. Bread, I was told, was the food of hippies. Villagers recounted that during their heyday, Arambepe's hippies had subsisted on bread and soda pop. Villagers also knew the hippies were supposed to smoke marijuana. Villagers seemed more resentful of hippies than in 1973. This was part of a more general pattern of hostility that had developed since my last visit, as change became less novel and more bothersome. One man chided me for calling the northern hippie settlement in Via Aldea. "Don't use that hippie name," he said. Caratinga is its proper name. Call it that. The villagers scorned the handful of village youths who were known to hang out with hippies. "What a shame," remarked Dora, of a 20-year-old native, "that she has associated herself with the low life of the hippies." Many villagers expressed low opinions of hippie morality. Hippies even rob each other, I was told. On a visit to the Aldea, I did meet an IPA from Portugal, spending a few days there, who complained of having $300 in traveler's checks stolen the night before. For traditional Arambeperos, robbery is highly stigmatized antisocial behavior. Both in 1973 and in 1980, I was repeatedly warned of robbers and assailants. The thief is a symbol that has come to summarize many fears and uncertainties that villagers have about the outside world. To classify hippies as robbers is to assign them a place outside the normal social life. As I was often assured, Arambeperos do not rob and have nothing to fear from each other. We may be poor, but we're not thieves. Hippies, by contrast, don't just rob, they steal from each other. In telling me this, Arambeperos were like vegetarians distinguishing between meat eating and cannibalism. Another symbol, speech, was also used to establish hippies' lesser humanity. As we know from our own culture, we feel most comfortable with people who talk the way we do. Arambeperos used the hippie speech to diagnose something more subtle, not just a social difference, but an incomplete humanity. Drugged, foreign, or both, people who uttered words without seeming sure of their meaning were seen as parrots, creatures capable of speech but not understanding. Until the arrival of the hippies, a German priest and American anthropologist had been the only foreigners the villagers had known. All of us were initially classified as papagayos. During my visits in the 1960s, I always felt that fieldwork in Arambepe was a linguistic struggle. Why, I wondered, was my ability to speak and understand Brazilian Portuguese so good in Rio and Sao Paulo, but so bad in Arambepe? Only later did I realize that talking like an Arambepero was as or more different from conversing in formal Brazilian Portuguese as the speech of a worker in Liverpool is from BBC English. Cut off from foreigners, outsiders, and even the national speech patterns that can now be heard each day on radio and television, traditional Arambeperos were as much linguistic chauvinists as any similarly isolated people. To speak was to talk like an Arambepero. Anything else smacked of parrot talk. When Alberto, informed of my return, rushed to Claudia's restaurant to welcome me in August 1980, his enthusiastic but tactless greeting was, "Oh, my Papago's come back." At the end of my stay, he commented that I used to be a Papago, but now I spoke more or less right. This evaluation may have been based on an actual improvement in my speech. More likely it reflected Alberto and Arambepe's growing familiarity with alien speech patterns. Consider a final illustration of the stigma attached to alien speech in traditional Arambepe. Part of the contemporary village lore is the story of a woman who in 1964 refused to give us full information when we were attempting to complete our interview schedule with all 159 households. Villagers insist that her daughter, born soon after our departure, never learned to speak like a native Arambepero. With speech that was all mixed up, the girl talked just like the foreigners to whom her mother had been inhospitable. The girl's plight was somehow her mother's punishment. The moral seems to be that in traditional Arambepe, Papagos, though less than human, should still have been treated courteously. Despite the view of hippies as robbers, Papagos, vagabonds, and incompletely human, many villagers simultaneously held a more positive image of the hippie lifestyle. One woman, after lamenting that some village youths were mixing with hippies, went on to say that they were good hippies too. Those people worked making handicrafts, behaved with decorum, spoke respectfully, and minded their own business, unlike the unreliable transients who were mostly the hippies who had become locals. If they were not fully part of the village social system, at least they didn't mock its values. The hippie aldea has grown up near the Karatingi River, a 30-minute walk north of Arambepe. One makes the trip along the beach or inland, wading through the lagoon. In summer, the lagoon dries up, making it possible to get there by car. Accompanied by Alberto and the 1980 field team, I visited the aldea for the first time on a Friday afternoon. Alberto was surprised to find so few people there. His estimate that the settlement once contained 200 people corresponded with that of the municipal statistician in Kamakari. The aldea had 3 separate sections. The southern area, the settlement's core, had 10 substantial wattle and daub huts with palm frond roofs. Just north of this area was a coconut grove with flimsy lean-tos made entirely of palm fronds. A bit further north was the river, where we saw 2 pup tents. 2 hippie couples and Joao, a 21-year-old man who normally lived alone, made their homes in the southern area. All made their living from handicrafts, but one man also painted. 3 of these people had gone into Salvador that day, one for medical attention, the other 2 to sell their wares to agents of the city's thriving tourist industry. 2 native men, brothers, one single, the other married, also lived here, and there was a native Arambepe woman who washed, sewed, and cooked for the hippies. Considered a bit deranged by Arambeperos and hippies alike, she habitually prayed to ocean and woods, and occasionally made an appearance in Arambepe proper, where she drank too much cachaca and sometimes removed her clothing in public. A would-be entrepreneur from Salvador had recently opened a bar where he sold rum. Using a team of animals, he had just brought the aldea its first refrigerator, powered by bottled gas. He planned to sell cold beer to tourists on weekends. The next part of Aldea was a poor person's version of a youth hostel. No rent was collected for the palm frond hovels, which barely provided shelter from sun and rain. This was a transient area where we had been told by an Arambepe hippie we could find American, English, German, Italian, and Danish hippies. It turned out to be the hangout of the low-life hippies that villagers vilified, the place where the Portuguese transient was robbed of her traveler's checks. Everyone I talked to here was scantily attired. Marijuana smoke, which Alberto had never smelled and didn't recognize, wafted through the walls of one hut. A bit further north was the Karatingi River, on the banks of which 2 tents had been set up. One belonged to a young man from Salvador, out for weekend camping. Standing in front of the other was a slight young man in a jumpsuit. This Paulista, or person from Sao Paulo, had come to Arambepe to vacation and to lose weight. His daily routine was to walk north to the mouth of the Jacupi River, a 3-hour round trip. He reported that his weight had fallen from 90 to 65 kilograms. 2 Amazon-sized women, his camping companions, then arrived. Now I understand why he needed to diet, since the pup tent looked hardly big enough for one. One of the women sat down and leafed through a photo magazine with pictures of women with bare breasts the size of her own. The other woman entered the tent and started giving orders to the man. These people, whom Arambeperos still classified as hippies, are perhaps more appropriately called campers. Participating in an international culture pattern, they travel to the warmer beaches of northern Brazil for the winter, just as young Americans make springtime visits to Florida. Although I had trouble determining the socioeconomic background of the hippies and young transients, Arambeperos insisted that it takes money to be a hippie. Villagers believed that many hippies were rich, which made it particularly hard for them to understand why hippies lived the way they did, eschewing the consumer goods that natives had done without until recently and now found tantalizing. It does take money to adopt the hippie lifestyle. Although he spent most of the year in Aldea, 21-year-old Joa used his earnings from making mobiles and curtains to travel to other hippie beach settlements. He trekked from Belém at the Amazon's mouth to the extreme Brazilian south, a distance of more than 3,000 kilometers. Joa had last seen one of his friends, also from Sao Paulo, spending a few days in the Aldea in 1980, in a beach settlement in southern Bahia. This young Paulista knew something about anthropology and told me he had taken part in an archaeological dig in Mato Grosso, information suggesting upper middle class status. There was no doubt of the privileged background of the young woman who was temporarily living in Joa's house. This Ipa claimed to have been born in Egypt of Jewish parents, to have moved to Brazil when she was 5, to have attended French schools in Rio, and have lived in Israeli kibbutz as a teenager. Besides the fluent Portuguese and English she spoke with us, claimed to speak French with her parents and to know Hebrew and Italian. The reason she spoke so many languages and traveled so much, she told anthropologist Maxine Margolis, is because she was Jewish. To the amusement of Maxine, who is Jewish, speaks several languages and travels a lot, the IPA explained that all Jews speak many languages and like to travel. There are fewer Jews in Brazil than in the United States. Our informant felt we needed to be enlightened about Jewish characteristics.